Hello, listeners of the Tooth and Coin podcast. This episode I'm doing from my home, so apologies for any audio quality issues compared to normal. We've got a sick kid at home, and I needed to get an episode out. I made a commitment to release an episode at least once a week, so even though it won't be as good of audio quality as our typical recording, this one will still be okay, and so I hope you'll bear with me. It's a really good one. So today, we're going to be talking about capacity, and some people may ask me, well, what is capacity and why is it important? And I'll tell you, capacity is one of those concepts that whenever you put context around it, you start realizing just how important it really is. A lot of the times, a lot of people asking me about the financial performance of their practice, and they'll get really upset about, well, A should be happening, or B should be happening, or why is this number high and this number low? What can I do to reduce this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is that if these clients knew what capacity was and where they were on their capacity journey, they would have already answered a lot of those questions. So hope you enjoy this episode. It's a really fascinating topic, and it's one that I hope can be demystified a bit by me talking here. It's concepts that have taken me a long time to the realizations of. So buckle up and enjoy the episode. So capacity. There are three different modes of capacity. And as a framework, the three different modes of capacity are physical space, it's time, and it's people. Now, you may be saying to yourself, like, well, that seems like a simplification, and it kind of is. If you think back to, if anyone's ever seen The Prophet with Marcus Lemonis, it was a fairly popular business show, 10, 20 years ago. And he had a saying that every business was a matter of people, processes, and product. And he's not incorrect. It's just that people, product, and process, when it relates to a business, depends on what part of the life cycle that entity your business is in. As an example, if you're someone selling something on a lemonade stand on the side of the road, your people, product, and process is going to be very different than if you are an international distributor of lemonade. Your challenges that you're facing are going to be very different. And the same holds true when it comes to capacity. It's a simple thing to think about. It's either going to be a physical space issue, it's going to be a time issue, or it's going to be a people issue. And the way I like to hammer those concepts in is a brief, and we'll dig more into this in a second, is from the physical space side. If you only had one operatory to work out of every day, you could only do so much dentistry. So you're limited in your amount of capacity. On the time side of it, if you're only open for an hour a day, you would also be extremely limited in the amount of dentistry that you do. On the people side is where it gets a bit more complex, and there's subcategories in my mind of how that piece works. Conceptually, if it was just you there every day, there was no front office, there was no assistants, there was no hygienist, then you could only do so much dentistry. So each of those are modes of constraints around capacity. Okay, so let's talk about the physical space component of capacity, and let's just kind of boil it down. The simplest way to create a measurement for this is to see how many operatories you have. If you have one operatory that you can only work out of, you're not going to be able to do as much dentistry as someone who has 50. The most common practices tend to be the single office owner, single doctor, working with no associates. Those practices, generally today, what I see is that if you are not planning on adding more doctors later, then you're usually okay with about 5 operatories. Anything less, and it can be a little bit more difficult to get upwards to higher levels of revenue. In terms of what I mean by higher levels of revenue, it seems to be most of our single docs like to get somewhere between the $1.2 and $1.5 million a year in revenue. And the 5 operatory practice seems to be a pretty common setup for that type of a practice. That usually equates into being the doctor is working out of 2 operatories every day. On 2 days out of a 4-day week, they'll work out of a 3rd operatory, and the other 2 days out of the week, there will be a hygienist that works out of there. So on the other side of that coin, there's 2 hygienists working each day of the 4 days, and 2 days of the week, there's another 2 days of hygiene going on. That's the most common setup of operatories that I see today and how they get filled up. So what does that mean in terms of capacity? Well, it effectively just means that if you have less than 5 operatories, you're going to have to figure out a different way of setting up that type of a structure, because the revenue that's generated from your patients is always going to be an output created by patients going into operatory receiving care, and then some receiving a treatment plan, and then the treatment plan being carried forward. The less operatories you have, the higher revenue per patient you have to be able to perform in order to meet the comparable volume to the larger operatory practices that get going on. So that's an important piece to understanding the physical space. There's different games you can play in terms of like how many are doctor chairs, how many are hygiene chairs, and it also kind of can depend on your schedule a little bit, which is kind of the time component. But the physical space one seems to be the simplest one to kind of spot. It seems to usually be pretty apparent in most of my docs' eyes whenever they aren't using all their operatories. We're not going to spend a ton more time on physical space. It's fairly self-explanatory. If you're bustling at the seams with 5 operatories, then you cannot grow without more physical space. There's no place to put the patients if you just got people in there every day. That's what the physical space component of capacity is. The next element of capacity is time. So time is also a pretty obvious capacity constraint. Time comes down to how many hours are you open? You could technically decide that you want to open 80 hours a week. You did that and you did it for long enough, you eventually would have enough patients to fill that capacity if you could keep it going and have the staff going and everything like that. So amount of time that you're open is an important piece of all of this. And it is an option to increase the amount of time that you work, but most people don't want to do that. And most people want to work their 32 hours on clinical side and maybe 8 hours on the administrative business side, and they want to be done with it. However, it's important to state that that is a lever that you can pull if you want to increase your capacity. The third element, and where we're going to spend most of our time today talking about, is the people side of capacity. There are a couple of different ways that this goes about. One is on the people side is your patients. Because if we have capacity, which is this thing that we've got to fill, what do we fill it with? We typically fill it with patients. However, the other side of that is that you also have to have team members to service those patients. So there's the people side of capacity, there's the patient side of it, and then there's the staff side. And then inside of the staff category, you have the doctors, you have the hygienists, you have the front office, and then you have your assistants. This is obviously for general dental practice, but the concepts stay the same no matter what type of practice you run. The units of measurement to determine an efficient use of staff members gets real complex, and there's not a whole lot of information that's out there that talks about that. It's something that is a bit difficult to quantify of what's good. So as an example, if we're seeing 20 patients a day and we have 4 front office people, is that an effective use of office people? Probably isn't. It's probably a really high number, right? But instead of looking at the capacity in this way, you're never really going to know how to measure these things. So to help give some understanding to the people side, let's use the concept of a startup practice. So let's pretend the startup's just opening up its doors tomorrow for the first time ever, and there's no patients. Maybe they've got a front office person, maybe they have an assistant. Well, what is the capacity for that practice? The way that I try and measure that is that I say that we've got a dentist. The dentist is 1 unit of measurement. And that dentist typically, once they have the hygienist in place, they have the assistants in place, and they have office team members helping the patients through things, that dentist can usually put into its roster of patients somewhere between 1,200 and 2,800 patients. A broad range. Why is it a broad range? The reason it's a broad range is because those are the 2 different sides of the spectrum that we typically see practices end up in. So the middle is about 2,000, high end's around 2,800, the low end's about 1,200. How does that come out into play, and what does it look like on the ends of that spectrum? The 1,200 patient practice typically is a higher end practice. It typically has more fee-for-service patients, typically has higher end procedures, and typically has less hygienist and more specialty services being offered, with patients that can pay a pretty large amount of money per treatment plan. Are there 1,200 patient practices that are bread and butter dentistry? Yes, absolutely so. Can those practices do really well too? Yes, absolutely. But that practice typically will do a lot of bread and butter dentistry per patient compared to the 2,800 patient practice. That's the other end of the spectrum. It's typically a volume practice that has a lot of patients coming through the door, and the dentist is seeing tons of patients. That difference in patient count is a really good reflection of just how different dental practices can be. So one of the reasons I'm talking on this podcast, because there are just so many rules of thumb that are out there that don't apply to everybody. And they really apply in the middle, not to those people on both ends of that spectrum. And so we've got a patient count of somewhere between 1,200 and 2,800 patients on the patient element of capacity. Well, for that startup is seeing 50 new patients a month, which is a little bit higher than average for the average startup. An average startup will see somewhere around 30 to 40 new patients in a month. But let's say it's 50 new patients a month this practice is seeing. If you're a dentist who wants to have 1,200 patients in your roster that you're trying to fill up, it's only going to take you 2 years to do that if you're at 50 new patients a month. You're going to have some attrition, so maybe add 20% to that. But it's important for you to be able to know that. Whereas if you are doing 2,800 patients, it's going to take you 50 to 60 months to be able to fill that practice up. That's 5 or 6 years, right? If you add on attrition. That gives you a time horizon to tell you how long it's going to take you to fill your capacity. Why is the time horizon important whenever it comes to filling your capacity? Well, it's important because if you don't like that horizon, then that's where you need to focus some of your energy. If 50 new patients a month isn't enough, then you're going to have to do something to figure out how to get to 60, 70, 80 to be able to make that go faster. The difficult part about this is that from a CPA's perspective is that we don't know anything about your new patient numbers. Right? That's not a part of what we look at. But a lot of times that can be a big factor in figuring out where you are on that growth chart. So back to the idea of the startup. Let's say it's an average startup doing an average dental practice and they want to hit 2,000 patients. They've got 50 new patients a month. Well, that's 40 months of new patients. Add on 20% attrition. It's about 4 years from today until when their practice is going to be completely filled up. Once we have that understanding, and let's say that they're happy with that growth rate, they're okay with it, they're not pushing the advertising a whole lot or whatever it may be. Well, over that 4-year cycle, say in year 2 to 3, well, the practice is still going to be busy. It's not going to feel like they have 25% capacity for more patients. It's just going to feel busy because that's what we do as humans. We fill up our days, we fill up our time, and it's hard to tell, like, where are we on this growth path? If you've taken the time to think of, like, well, here's where we're heading, then you can build around that. The results from a financial side of things, this is where people start getting hung up in making errors and understanding how benchmarks work. So a lot of people say, like, oh, my staffing cost is supposed to be 25%. It can't be 25% because it's 30 to 35% right now. When in reality, the reason that's happening is because they are under capacitized. They have the people there built for a practice that is ready for 2,000 patients. But as of today, they only have 1,500. And so that can be a big issue. That's the patient side. And that's the bigger overarching concept of all of this is, you've got to have the space built out. You've got to have the time that you're open. And then you have to have the patients coming through. And then finally, you also have to have the team members that are supporting those patients. The growth of the team is a really critical element in this. So there are some rules of thumbs that I like when we're trying to map out how this looks. So some of the rules of thumb that I like is I like 200 hygiene patients per hygiene day. I like that number. It makes sense to me. I can map it out in my head. And the math out in my head is simply that if there's a day of hygiene with 8 hygiene slots available, so it's an hour hygiene spot for 8 hours, and there's 50 weeks in a year, 50 times 8 is 400. Well, if a patient comes twice a year, then that's 200 spots for a hygiene patient, right? So that rule of thumb actually makes a lot of logical sense. Now we can start making it more complex and say, well, what about perio? What about, scaling your route planning and all these longer appointment times? Yeah, those exist as well, but I like the starting basing piece of that to be 200 patients per hygiene day. And so why is that important again for that startup practice? It's because until we have 200 hygiene patients, they may not need to have a full day of hygiene come in. Maybe they can deal with doing it on their own until they get to that level. Maybe, right? It depends on user preference, dealer's choice, whatever you want to call it for that dentist. I like that metric. I like the metric of, again, and this is an average, somewhere between 400 and 600 patients per doctor day. Why is that important? Let's fast forward to year 4 for that startup and say that they're at the point now they've got 2,000 patients. Well, this doctor is completely capacitized. And they know that their new patient rate is about 50 new patients a month. We're assuming a lot here. We're assuming that that their 50 new patients a month is what they want, and B, that's going to stay consistent. Believe it or not, it's actually really, really common that dental practices have similar numbers of new patients every month. A lot of people don't talk about that, but I do find that to be typically the case. Why is 400 to 600 patients per doctor day important? Well, that person's thinking about adding an associate. They need to know how long it's going to take them to fill up those days. So let's say we have 50 new patients a month coming in, and we want to get to, say, 500 new patients. It's going to take 10 months to get 1 day of doctor days to be filled up. Until then, you are going to be giving that associate some of your patients to work on, which means not only are you not going to be getting the revenue generated from doing the dentistry for that patient, you're also going to have to be paying somebody else for it. I call it the cannibalization of dentistry. I'll talk about it today. I'll talk about it tons of times on the podcast. It's where you give the associate work to do. You, as a producer, would have produced, let's say, $1,000. The associate isn't as skilled as you are. Maybe they don't have the same skill set, whatever it may be, and they produce, say, $750. You're out the $250 spread between what you would have produced that was higher, plus you've got to pay that other person, say, $250 of the $750 that they produced. You get $500, whereas if you would have done the work, you'd have gotten $1,000. So you lose $500 on that patient. And that patient, by the way, is not a new patient. That's a patient that was already in your practice that would have been serviced because you aren't at full capacity. Same concept applies as before. If you're completely filled up and there's a new person there, but they have no patients to work on, they have no operatories to work out, they have no time, they're there, and they wouldn't have anything to do. But this person obviously is there. So we're obviously your capacity underneath your wings is going to spread out to him or her in the associate piece of it. And that means that unless we have new patients coming in and adding to that column, that doctor's not going to be very busy. And it's going to be a big investment to move on with that. I'm not talking a ton about like goals and like different things you can do in terms of setting your own personal preferences, because there's a ton of like, well, if, I don't want to do the dentistry and I want to have an associate driven practice. Yes, you can do that too. All these rules apply to everybody on this. And I'm not calling anybody out to say anybody's right or wrong on how this works, but this is how, from a concept basis, to approach looking at this, because where that office is on the capacity path, the capacity plan, the capacity trajectory, the journey, whatever you want to call it, is important. And you need to know where you are on that so that you can put context around everything else. So talked about the patient side of things. And again, the spectrums that go along with that. We talked about how to view new patient flow, because that's a really important metric. Like if you think of like the old Y equals MX plus B charting of things, the 50 new patients a month is your coefficient that shows you how far up you're going to go. So it's really important to have that be a healthy number. And there's a lot of things that you can do to do that. This episode's not about analyzing marketing expenses or ROIs or anything like that, but it's a really important piece of that whole puzzle. So important elements that go along with it. The next piece, again, is the staff. So I've talked about, I like the 200 patients per day on the hygiene side. I like the 400 to 600 patients per doctor day, depending on the type of practice you have, type of dentistry being done. What are some of the other things that I like? I like having daily goals in terms of how much in production needs to be done in a day, but that doesn't really fall into the capacity game. It doesn't really fall into the capacity side of things. I don't have a number for how many people go through a front office per front office person. I believe I can remember Sandy Perdue, who is fantastic. I believe I can recall her saying that around 23 patients per front office person per day, if I remember correctly. I could be completely wrong on that, but that is a rule of thumb that's possible on the front office side of things. On the assistant side, that just depends on how many columns you're working out of. On the dentist side, that's really kind of the people component of capacity. And I hope that's helpful in just kind of explaining all the pieces that go along with that, because if you don't know where you are on those things, it's going to be really hard to determine why your financial performance may not be going the way that you want it to. Okay, so now that we've talked about the different pieces of the capacity, let's talk about what we do with this. I tell people that, again, the main number you want to focus on is active patients, but you have to think of that in terms of that's when you're filled up. That's when you can start deciding on if I want to add days, if I want to add a hygienist, if I want to add associate, whatever it may be. And I talked about this in a past episode that there was an old rule of thumb, was like if you're at 1 to 1.5 million in revenue, that's when you're ready for an associate. I find using the numbers of patients is a way better measure of that than the dollars per month metric, because it's so different based off of the kind of practice you have. A reframing of something that I think people need to be paying attention to. One is you have to start thinking of how many patients a day you see on each different type of patient. So hygiene patients and doctor-related patients. Not very many people seem to pay attention to that as a metric, and I find that really surprising. Obviously, we look at on the CPA side, like, oh, staffing costs is a percentage of revenue, but we don't look at, efficiency of staff based off of number of patients coming through the door. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what I would track if I was someone trying to look at these things. We track things so that we can manage them and we can put our efforts and focuses into changing those things for good. A big mistake I see a lot of dentists make is that they will try to optimize these things before they're at capacity. And that's fine, but you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck if you're at capacity and then you optimize. I tell people you can really only focus on a few things at one time when you're trying to do a business if you are the person doing the service inside of the business at the same time. And to me, it's like, well, let's focus at getting into capacity first, and then we can optimize. And if we then optimize, we're going to see so much more value because of the fact that it's just going to be really efficient on a whole practice side of things. As an example, if you only have 100 patients and you increase your revenue by $10 a patient, well, you just increase your revenue by $1,000. If you have 2,000 patients, then you just increase your revenue by $20,000, right? So it's a 20x difference on increasing those things. Same thing if you reduce your costs, same thing as if you do those other pieces of it too. The game of capacity is getting as close to capacity as you can and then optimizing. I think Scott Luna talks about this a lot in some of his stuff, where he talks about how you should remove the barriers of entry to your practice for patients and fill up your practice and then worry about doing the optimization stuff. That's completely correct and completely in line with how I think about it as well. To me, doing the things like removing your PPOs and stuff like that and going out of network, those are things that you can do once you've reached capacity. Prior to you being at capacity, it's kind of the hard mode, if you will, of moving towards capacity, but it can be done if you want to. So to the things that I would be tracking if I was a dentist and I had my own dental practice and I was trying to keep an understanding of capacity and measurement and activity and things like that. On the physical space side, it's easy. It's just number of operatories split between doctor and hygiene days. I would use those metrics I talked about earlier, the rule of thumb, the 200 per hygiene day, the 400 to 600 per doctor day, depending on the type of dentistry that you do. It could be even low as 300 patients on your active patient count. On time, that's also an easy one. It's just what days you're open. Only open 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and you feel like you're at capacity. Well, open another day. I don't know what to say there. On the people side is where it gets a little bit more complex. And I tried to simplify this into as few numbers as possible. But the numbers I'd track on the patient side is I would see the patient seen on a monthly basis, as well as the number of days that we were open in that month. So I could have a patient seen per day metric. It's an average. The averages are where we end up at. Obviously, some days are busier than others, but at least we can come to some type of baseline and understanding of like where we are on an average day of patient seen. Now I do that by the doctor side as well as the hygiene side. I'd be tracking how many front office people we have, because that's a metric, right? Front office people per patient seen per day. I'd be keeping up with my active patient count. This number is hard to do in dentistry because the practice management softwares aren't really that great at doing it. If you don't change the settings in there and you don't go and make sure that they're active, you will end up with a bunch of people that are considered to be active but aren't really. So that is going to take a very, very intentional mindset of like once a month culling the book for people that aren't normally active anymore. And I'd give myself some baseline rules on that. I would say if they hadn't been in the last 18 months, they're probably not active. And even then, if I was doing that and I said, hey, the 18-month period is not my period where I'm going to be getting rid of patients or removing them from the books, I'd probably have like some type of a program for once they move from that 18 to 36 month category, they're considered inactive, but I'd have some type of remarketing campaign to be able to see if I can get those people back in the door somehow, because it's been so long since I've seen them, and let them know that we care. We want them to come see us. That way we don't lose them as a patient. That's another story. I'd be keeping up with on the doctor side of the patients that we see. So we have the number of patients per day seen metric. I would want to know how many treatment plans we did per day on average. If you see 10 patients on the doctor side, some days you'll give 2 treatment plans out, some days you'll give 8. But I want to know the average and just quantity of plans given out. And then after that, I want to know what is the average treatment plan size that I give out. And then after that, I want to know of the treatment plans that were presented, how many of them were scheduled/accepted. Why do I want to know that? I want to know that because of the fact that if there's ever an issue there, if I ever decide that number is too small, then I can maybe focus on how do I convert more patients to say yes. If I think that maybe my treatment plan size is too small, or I see it dipping some, maybe I'm not treatment planning as much as I was before. And why is that? And I need to be reflective of that. So those are the reasons I track those numbers. Number of assistants is another one. Again, the rule of thumb on this is you never hire an associate if you could use another assistant. And I've had doctors come to me in the past that are at 600,000 in revenue. They're like, I think I need an associate because we're really busy. And they have like one assistant. I tell them, hey, you need to probably get another assistant, work out of an additional column prior to you hiring another doctor to come in. Because all you're going to do when you add that doctor is move your capacity from 2,000 or even 1,200 to 2,400 to 4,000, 5,600, whatever it may be. Then obviously be tracking my new patients per month. And those would be kind of the people metrics that I would track in terms of capacity. Some dollar value numbers that I'd also track kind of as an aside that would be reflective of some of these things. The total production for the practice on a doctor basis as well as a hygiene basis. And then I'd take those based off of how many visits they have to just to see those numbers. I'd obviously be looking at my AR, be looking at 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 90, 90 plus days. I'd be looking at how many days were booked out for a new patient as well as days booked out for hygiene, because those metrics are fantastic, like shortcuts to understanding if you're at capacity or not. Because if you're 6 weeks booked out for a new patient and 3 months booked out for hygiene, you're probably at capacity, or we're being inefficient with how we're scheduling. It's one of the two. So either we're not open enough hours out of the day, or we need more operatories or something. I'd be looking at the hygiene reappointment rate. I'd also be looking at the percentage of patients in hygiene. So like how many of my patients that are in my active patient count, how many are in the hygiene protocol? Some different hygiene consultants have told me in the past, anywhere from 60 to 80% of your patients should be active in your hygiene protocol. I've talked to some really high producing doctors that don't really agree with that. And again, this is from other people's mouths to my ears. They're more worried about the big cases. And once they've done the big case for that patient, then that big case probably isn't going to come back. So they're not as worried about them being a recall. It's a different game for them in terms of their business than it is for a typical GP practice. So yeah, those would be the numbers that I would track if I was to be a dentist that owned my own practice. At Tooth & Coin, for CPA firm, we're not a practice management consulting company. So I don't track any of these for any of our clients. We have been considering to be able to help people kind of have a gauge on the business side of things, because what we see on the financial performance side of things is we see the end result. We see the dollar value ending points of what happened from the bank accounts and credit card accounts and loans, et cetera. But we don't see any of those numbers. Literally every number I just told you is not on a financial statement. It is not something that is shared with a CPA firm, because it's not a part of our purview. It's not a part of what our services include. But we are considering adding that as a separate reporting standard where we'd have a team that could help our clients put this type of tracking together, almost like a business coaching type of a protocol for keeping up with capacity and understanding where your practice is. Because really, when someone says to me, hey, my staffing percentage is high, why is that? What can I do to fix it? It's usually one of those numbers that I just talked about, like how many front office people we have for our patient visits, what our active patient count is, new patients a month, days booked out. It's one of those things usually that's really kind of telling us where the issue is. So it's November of 2024. We don't currently have that as a service we offer, but we've been considering it because I'm super geeky about this stuff. And I just love talking about numbers inside of dentistry. And I think it's really fascinating. And since we have 400 offices that we help out with, if I had that data for 400 practices, it'd be really cool. Now I get it. There's some business intelligence softwares out there that tell you a whole lot about your practice, but I prefer the more simplified number look right now. And it's possible that they're going to listen to this podcast and just create a dashboard that has all this information on there. I don't know. If they do, that's awesome. I'll be a customer. So reach out if you guys decide to do that. So we talked today about capacity. I think it's a really fascinating topic. I think it's not talked about near enough in this industry because it's really important. Everybody talked about, I want 55% overhead, but people don't really talk about the fact that the people that are the most profitable in this industry, they typically have either a really high acceptance for treatment plan percentage, or they have a really high dollar value of treatment plans, or both. So everybody talks about the overhead percentage, but nobody talks about percentage of treatment plans accepted being like a metric you hang your hat on. So anyway, I hope you found value in this episode. I hope that the audio comes in good enough to be able to get all the pieces of it. If it doesn't, if I get a lot of feedback, maybe in 6 months, I'll re-record it or like make it a little bit fancier, turn it into a webinar. I've been thinking about putting a report together and doing some research and analysis on these different numbers from practices we have as well. And maybe have that be something that I can give to the Tooth & Coin listeners as a report. I think it'd be fascinating for people. So if you have any comments on anything that was said today, if there's any metrics you would look at that you would track that I didn't mention that are related to capacity or related to like finding those holes in your practice, feel free to put those in the comments over on YouTube and let us know, or in a review for whatever social media platform or podcast listening place of your choice. So this has been Jonathan, and we're talking about capacity, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Until next time. Thanks for tuning in to the Tooth and Coin podcast. If you found value in today's episode, please share it with a fellow dentist or a practice owner who could benefit. Your word of mouth helps us spread financial wisdom throughout the dental community. So until next time, keep building that thriving practice.